I come through the ring, I notice everybody, I can hear you breathing. I can hear you talking. I hear everything. I hear my friends talk. I don't understand, but I hear them talking. I hear their words. I hear their voices. I hear everything. I see everyone, but I hear more than I see them. No one's focused where they say they don't hear anything. And when you really focus, you hear everything. It's almost like it's almost like being on mushrooms or something, where you're living outside of reality, but you're in the midst of it. Does that make any sense?
One afternoon, former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson sat peacefully on a street bench, observing the ebb and flow of everyday life around him. Content in his attempt to fade into the background, he sought solace in the simple moments of life. Dressed in a casual tracksuit, Tyson appeared to be just another man in the city. Nearby, a group of kids whispered excitedly as they recognized the legendary boxer, though they were too shy to approach him. The air was filled with the aroma of grilled meat, signaling the arrival of a local food vendor eager to begin another day of business. As the scent permeated the atmosphere, Tyson, his muscular physique at ease, sat perched on the bench, gently sipping from a bottle of water he had recently purchased. The former champion, accustomed to the glitz and glamour of the ring, seemed at peace in this moment, content to blend into the hustle and bustle of everyday life. His authoritative gait, however, carried with it a presence of intimidation. Officer Brad Wilkins patrolled the area, his attitude sharp and confrontational. Renowned for his blatant bigotry, Wilkins harbored a deep-seated hatred for people of color, masking his prejudice behind the guise of a law enforcement badge. His volatile temperament, coupled with an inflated sense of self-importance, set the stage for an inevitable confrontation. With a track record marred by police brutality, Wilkins strutted the streets, eager to satisfy his craving for power and dominance. As Officer Wilkins laid his cold, calculating gaze upon Tyson, his mind was already set. He saw Tyson as nothing more than just another black man aimlessly loitering, devoid of purpose. His eyes narrowed and a smirk crept across his face. He reveled in the opportunity to exercise his authority, believing it was his right to subjugate the perceived criminal. Each step Wilkins took brought him closer to Tyson, his arrogance swelling and fueling his misguided mission to assert his superiority. Tyson, unsuspecting and unaware of the storm brewing mere meters away, continued to bask in the serene surroundings. He was oblivious to the officer's approach, lost in the peaceful moment. As Wilkins neared, his lips curled into a smug smile, and he addressed Tyson with a dismissive tone. "Hey, you!" "Yeah, you on the bench. What are you doing just sitting there?" His voice was dripping with arrogance and condescension. Wilkins punctuated his question with a knowing nod, convinced that Tyson, like so many others before him, would cower at the sight of his uniform. However, Wilkins remained blissfully ignorant of the force he was antagonizing. He was unaware that Tyson's calm exterior concealed a tempestuous history of ruthless aggression and unparalleled strength. Tyson's piercing gaze flicked upwards, a single brow arching in response to the officer's unwarranted intrusion. "Is sitting illegal now?" Tyson asked, his words carrying an undercurrent of mocking incredulity. Wilkins, unwilling to relinquish his perceived dominance, scoffed. "You know damn well what I mean. What's a guy like you doing just hanging around here?" The emphasis Wilkins placed on the word guy was laced with racial animus, a thinly veiled reminder of the biases that underpinned his very being. But Tyson, impervious to the officer's blatant bigotry, let loose a sly smirk and shook his head dismissively. With a measured sip of water, Tyson remained stoic. His silence was a stark rebuke of Wilkins' attempts at provocation. Years of facing down fearsome opponents in the ring had instilled in Tyson a sense of inner strength and resilience that refused to be diminished by the petulant taunts of a man who derived his power from a shiny badge. As Wilkins' efforts to intimidate faltered, his ego bruised by Tyson's unaffected demeanor, his frustration reached a fever pitch. The silence between them grew interminable and unnerving, gnawing at Wilkins and corroding his illusion of control. Each passing moment without a response chipped away at the facade of bravado he had so carefully constructed. exposing the insecurities that festered beneath his bluster. Tyson's calm confidence, a weapon honed to perfection within the ropes of the boxing ring, proved to be just as formidable outside of it. His poise disarmed Wilkins, leaving the officer seething with impotent rage. The officer's mockery grew more venomous as he spat out his next words, his thinly veiled racism rearing its ugly head. "What, you deaf?" I said. "Get the hell up, boy." The word boy was loaded with centuries of oppression, cutting through the air like a blade. It was a deliberate and calculated attempt to emasculate Tyson and assert Wilkins's dominance. But Tyson remained steadfast. The word boy rang hollow against the backdrop of Tyson's accomplishments and the countless foes he had vanquished in the ring. Tyson's muscles tensed ever so slightly, a fleeting glimpse into the restrained power that coursed through his veins. Yet his expression remained impassive, his face a stoic mask that betrayed none of the simmering emotions lurking just beneath the surface. Wilkins, blind to the internal struggle within Tyson's psyche, mistook his composure for weakness. He assumed that the calmness was a sign of submission, a mistake that would soon have consequences. As the standoff intensified, a subtle shift occurred within the environment. Passers-by, drawn by the palpable tension, ceased their motions. Their gazes were riveted to the unfolding spectacle. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, snippets of hushed conversation punctuated by gasps of recognition. "That's Mike Tyson," one person whispered, smartphone in hand, eager to capture the scene. "He's messing with the wrong guy." A collective sense of dread began to build, a shared understanding that something monumental was about to happen. The calm before the storm had grown more charged by the second. Wilkins, oblivious to the growing unease around him, pressed on. His sneer became grotesque as he leaned into Tyson's personal space, and the slur, steeped in bigotry and dripping with malice, left his lips with a venomous hiss. "I said speak up, knucker," he spat, unaware of the consequences that would soon unfold. Time seemed to slow as his words hung in the air, suspended by the intensity of the moment. The charged atmosphere, pregnant with the promise of chaos, felt like a taut wire, ready to snap at any second. The crowd, captivated and horrified, instinctively understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in time. It was a precipice from which there would be no turning back. The tension in the air was suffocating, and all that remained was the palpable anticipation of the inevitable. Tyson, coiled like a spring, was poised on the edge of a volcanic eruption. The insult had become the catalyst for the devastation that was about to unfold. As the silence descended, time itself seemed to grind to a halt. Movement ceased, cars stalled in their tracks, and all that remained was the sense of inevitable chaos that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The collective breath of the crowd seemed to hold steady, the murmurs now replaced with a heavy stillness. Each person present understanding that this moment, this confrontation, was something that would not be easily forgotten. The consciousness of the crowd, united in a single, foreboding thought, had erected an invisible barrier between them and the impending disaster. A silent plea for Officer Wilkins to retreat, to avoid what was about to unfold, was felt by all. Yet Wilkins, his hatred and arrogance blinding him to the danger, continued to stand firm, unaware that the powder keg of violence was mere milliseconds away from igniting. Tyson's movements were deliberate and controlled, a stark contrast to the tempestuous fury that now swirled within him. With a slow, measured motion, he placed his water bottle on the bench. The plastic bottle's exterior clinked softly against the wood, and Tyson's fingers curled into fists, flexed and straining in anticipation, tendons taut beneath the skin. As the light receded from his face, swallowed by the gathering storm of rage, his expression contorted into a menacing scowl, a countenance that looked like a man on the brink of annihilation. A whispered murmur floated through the crowd, fraught with disbelief and horror, as the onlookers began to comprehend the grim reality of the situation. The words were a somber epitaph for Wilkins' life. "Oh, this guy just signed his death certificate." The weight of the words carried a finality, an acknowledgement that bloodshed was imminent, that the events unfolding before them would irrevocably alter the course of the day. As the crowd understood the gravity of the situation, a heavy hush fell over them. It was a communal realization, a collective understanding that they were about to witness a moment of irreparable violence. In a single fluid motion, Tyson rose to his full height, a monolith of raw power and coiled strength. As he straightened, Wilkins was thrust into the uncomfortable realization that he was no longer looking down upon his quarry, but was now forced to crane his neck upward, the shift in position signaling a gesture of submission. The sheer physicality of Tyson was staggering. His frame exuded an aura of primal dominance, an unspoken warning that left Wilkins reeling. His confidence, built on years of authority and arrogance, was shaken by the sheer enormity of the beast that stood before him. Tyson's voice, a guttural growl that emanated from the depths of his being, reverberated through the air, heavy with menace and dripping with venom. "What did you just say to me?" he repeated, each syllable an accusation and a promise of retribution for the offense that had been dealt. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as he spoke. A tangible chill settled over the scene, as if the world itself recognized the impending cataclysm. Wilkins, his bravado now reduced to a mere whimper, stammered in response, realizing too late the gravity of his mistake. Still obstinate in his ignorance, Wilkins attempted to regain control of the situation, offering a weak smirk, an attempt to mask his rapidly fraying nerves. "You heard me now, what?" he sneered, his voice trembling in a pathetic imitation of taunting. "You want to do something about it?" he continued, his arrogance now a frail shield against the tidal wave of rage that was rapidly bearing down on him. But before Wilkins could utter another syllable, Tyson's hand shot out, seizing the officer's vest in a vice-like grip with effortless precision. In an instant, Tyson hoisted Wilkins off the ground, his feet dangling helplessly above the pavement as the air rushed from his lungs. With a deafening crack, Wilkins was flung against a nearby lamppost. His body collided with the unforgiving metal with such force that the pole itself seemed to shake from the impact. Wilkins gasped, his lungs burning, struggling to draw breath. The sudden shift in perspective, from would-be tormentor to helpless victim, left him disoriented and bewildered. He was dangling like a rag doll, his feet kicking feebly against the air. The officer was left in no doubt as to the dire nature of his situation. The pain radiating through his body, like wildfire, was a constant reminder of the grave error he had made in underestimating his opponent. Leaning in close, so close that his hot breath brushed against Wilkins' cheek, Tyson hissed his words like a viper. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he growled. The words rolled off his tongue like a promise of violence to come. The quiet fury in his voice carried the weight of every battle he had ever fought, and it shook Wilkins to his core. In that moment, he finally grasped the magnitude of his mistake. He understood with chilling clarity that he had awoken a sleeping giant, a beast that would show no mercy in its retribution. With a casual flick of his wrist, Tyson released his grip, allowing Wilkins to fall back to earth like a discarded plaything. The officer stumbled, his legs shaky and unsteady as he struggled to regain his footing. The sudden rush of gravity, combined with the release of Tyson's unrelenting grip, left Wilkins reeling. A dull ache throbbed through his joints as he staggered backward, desperate to put some distance between himself and the furious heavyweight. In a frenzy of desperation, Wilkins raised his baton, his arm trembling with rage as he prepared to strike. The air was thick with tension. The crowd held its collective breath, watching with bated anticipation as Wilkins mustered all of his strength for the impending blow. But before the baton could even descend, Tyson's fist shot out, lightning quick, connecting with Wilkins' face in a savage uppercut that sent the officer sprawling backward. The baton clattered uselessly to the ground, forgotten in the wake of the violent exchange. Wilkins' face, now a bloody mask of rage and pain, twisted as he pushed himself to his knees. The ferocity of Tyson's blow reverberated through his skull, disorienting him further. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Tyson snarled through gritted teeth. His words were a clumsy attempt by Wilkins to salvage some semblance of dominance, but they rang hollow. His body ached, every fiber of his being crying out in protest against the onslaught of Tyson's power. Yet even as he knelt before the boxer, Wilkins' arrogance refused to be quelled. The ego that had driven him to this point, pushing him to provoke the heavyweight champion, would not allow him to admit defeat. With a guttural cry, Wilkins swung his baton with all the force he could muster. The desperation of a cornered animal surged through his veins. In his mind, the blow was swift, executed with a speed born of rage and adrenaline. But to Tyson, a man who had danced with death in the ring countless times, Wilkins' actions were slow, predictable. The arc of the baton, the pivot of Wilkins' hips, the shift in his weight, all of it was visible to Tyson in vivid detail. With a speed and precision that belied his size, Tyson reached out and intercepted Wilkins' wrist. The bones ground together under the pressure of his grip, and Wilkins let out a sharp yelp of pain. The sound cut through the stunned silence of the onlookers. In a single fluid motion, Tyson flicked his wrist, sending the baton hurtling across the street with a loud clatter. Wilkins was now disarmed and at Tyson's mercy. He shrank back in fear, the pain in his wrist a constant reminder of the iron grip that held him fast. Tyson's voice, low and dangerous, pierced through the stillness like a razor. "You like to hit people, huh?" he growled. "Let's see how you like it." The barely contained fury in his tone was chilling, and it sent a shiver through Wilkins' bones. The boxer, known for his relentless brutality in the ring, now stood poised to unleash that same fury upon his helpless opponent. Wilkins' eyes darted around in panic. He realized with dawning horror that he was not dealing with a mere man, but with a force of nature, a primal predator about to claim its prey. The sound of flesh and bone colliding reverberated through the street, a sickening thud that signaled the beginning of Wilkins' undoing. Tyson's fist connected with the officer's gut with bone-crushing force. The impact was enough to hurl Wilkins into the air, his body twisting and contorting in agony. For a moment, Wilkins seemed to hang suspended in the air before gravity took hold, pulling him back to earth with a thud that echoed his shattered pride. As Wilkins' body crumpled to the ground, the crowd looked on in horrified awe. Their shocked gasps were a testament to the supernatural strength that had just been unleashed before them. It was as if they had just witnessed a mythological being step forth from legend, a creature whose power defied the laws of physics and humanity alike. Tyson stood over the officer, a towering figure of wrath and strength, as the silence that followed hung heavy in the air, thick with the realization of the monumental violence they had just witnessed. The swagger of a god, once an almost mythical presence, was no longer confined to the identity of just a man. It had evolved into something more profound, a symbol of the raw, untamed fury that resides dormant within us all. Mike Tyson, standing there, was more than just a former heavyweight champion. He had become a living, breathing representation of primal power and retribution. His words, deceptively calm, carried an underlying menace that threatened to explode at the slightest provocation. "Get up," he intoned, his voice soft but laced with an undeniable threat, signaling that further violence would follow if Officer Wilkins did not comply. The boxer's muscles were coiled, his body taut and ready to strike once again, his every movement embodying the epitome of controlled aggression. Wilkins, now cowering on the ground, was nothing more than a broken man in this moment. His earlier bravado evaporated as fear overwhelmed him. His legs trembled with every attempt to rise, his arms shaking as they clawed for stability, and his eyes pleaded silently for mercy, a mercy he knew would not come. With a groan, Wilkins finally managed to push himself to his knees. He dared not look up, locking his gaze instead on the ground, as if avoiding the intensity of Tyson's piercing stare would somehow shield him from the consequences of his actions. The silence between them was thick, pregnant with the weight of impending judgment, until Tyson broke it with a mocking question. "Didn't you want to fight?" The taunt was more than just a verbal jab. It was a cruel reminder of Wilkins's earlier arrogance, a cruel reversal of fate that had left the officer humiliated and on the receiving end of the violence he had once wielded so freely. The situation had become so surreal that even Wilkins, with his self-inflicted arrogance and prejudice, couldn't help but realize the magnitude of his mistake. He had thrown the first punch, but now he was the one cowering, the victim of his own bluster. Still, in a final, desperate attempt to cling to any shred of dignity, Wilkins lashed out with a wild haymaker, a feeble, uncontrolled swing aimed more out of desperation than true intent. It was a move that Tyson had anticipated effortlessly. Tyson, with the predatory instincts of a seasoned boxer, sidestepped the blow with grace that defied his size. His movement was smooth and deliberate, as if he were performing a deadly dance rather than engaging in a fight. Then in a blur of motion, Tyson unleashed a devastating right hook that struck Wilkins squarely in the jaw. The sound of flesh meeting bone was deafening, and the force of the punch sent the officer sprawling backward, his body crumpling to the ground like a rag doll. Wilkins's world spun, darkness encroaching as his consciousness flickered out, and the crowd watched in stunned awe as the once imposing officer was reduced to a broken shell of a man. The onlookers, initially silent, erupted into cheers. The sight of Wilkins's unconscious body hitting the ground was almost cinematic, an action movie moment brought to life in brutal reality. It was the kind of power that defied belief, a physical display of force that seemed beyond the realm of possibility. Yet there it was, in front of them all. As Wilkins's body lay lifeless on the pavement, the crowd reacted not with fear, but with exhilaration. The bully had finally received his comeuppance, and the weight of that catharsis flooded the air with a collective sense of justice. A solitary man in the crowd, overwhelmed by the absurdity and dark humor of the moment, laughed out loud, his voice rising above the cheers. "That boy just got put to sleep," he bellowed, his words a mixture of disbelief and amusement. His laughter echoed through the crowd, a shared understanding of the raw irony unfolding before them. Wilkins, still unconscious, groaned faintly, his body twitching as his senses slowly returned to him. The full impact of Tyson's punch had left him battered, his face a grotesque sight, swollen and bruised from the force of the blow. The officer was no longer the image of authority. He was now a broken man, a shadow of his former self. Even in his defeated state, Wilkins's arrogance refused to die. His mind raced, already formulating plans for revenge, even as his body ached with the aftermath of Tyson's retribution. As Wilkins struggled to regain some semblance of composure, the stillness of the moment was shattered by the shrill wail of police sirens. The sound was sharp, urgent, and filled the air with the promise of chaos. Within moments, squad cars screeched to a halt, their tires burning rubber as they came to a stop. The officers poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn, their training kicking in as they quickly assessed the situation. The lead officer, a man whose posture exuded authority, barked out an order. "Step away from him!" His voice boomed, unwavering and commanding, his weapon aimed at Tyson, who stood there unmoving, his eyes fixed on the officers. The tension in the air was palpable, the potential for further violence hanging like a storm cloud over the scene. Tyson, unflinching in his resolve, raised his hands in a calm, deliberate gesture of surrender. It was a stark contrast to the aggression he had displayed moments before. "Relax, fellas," Tyson said, his tone nonchalant, almost casual, as he addressed the officers. "Your boy here was just learning a lesson." The words were spoken with a smirk, as if the brutal beating of Wilkins had been no more than a light reprimand, a slap on the wrist. The senior officer, clearly assessing the situation with a more seasoned eye, took in the sight of Wilkins's battered form and then turned his attention to the crowd. He demanded an explanation, his voice sharp with authority. "What happened?" he asked, his words cutting through the growing tension like a knife. The crowd, still processing the surreal events they had just witnessed, buzzed with whispers, each person eager to recount their version of what had transpired, each version of the story as valid as the next in their eyes. The moment the question left the officer's lips, voices erupted from all sides. "Your guy started it," shouted one man, his voice rising above the others. "Called him the N-word," came another voice, the anger palpable in the air. "Harassed him for no reason," added a third. In mere moments, Wilkins' actions were laid bare for all to see, his racial animus, his arrogance, and his bigotry no longer hidden behind the badge he wore. The senior officer, his face a mask of disappointment, turned his attention to Wilkins. The sight of his colleague in such a pitiful state seemed to deflate him. With a heavy sigh and a slow shake of his head, he muttered to himself, "Jesus, Brad," his voice thick with exasperation. "What the hell is wrong with you?" The words hung in the air, unanswered. They were an indictment of Wilkins' conduct, a condemnation of his racism and his recklessness. The senior officer's gaze shifted back to Tyson, and recognizing the legendary boxer in his midst, he nodded respectfully. "Mr. Tyson, I know who you are, and from what I'm hearing, you were defending yourself," the officer said. His voice had softened, an understanding now present in his words, as if Tyson's actions, while brutal, were justified by the circumstances. There was no condemnation in his tone, just the understanding that, in this case, justice had been served, even if it was outside the boundaries of the law. The crowd, sensing the shift in the mood, relaxed slightly. The tension that had been so thick in the air began to dissipate. The senior officer, now standing over Wilkins with a mixture of disappointment and resolve, turned back to Tyson. "You're free to go," he said, the words carrying with them a sense of finality, as if acknowledging that the battle had already been won, not in the courtroom, but in the street. Tyson, his expression unreadable, offered a simple nod of acknowledgement. His stoic demeanor revealed nothing of the storm that had raged within him moments before. With that, he turned, walking away from the chaos he had just unleashed, his back to the scene of his retribution. As he walked into the evening sun, the crowd erupted into spontaneous applause. It was not a roar of victory, but a collective exhale, a catharsis that had been a long time coming. Tyson was no longer just a boxer in their eyes. He had become a symbol of righteous justice, a defiant force against the bigotry and hatred that plagued their society. The applause followed him as he disappeared around the corner, the sound fading into the distance like the final notes of a grand symphony. That night, as the world continued to turn, the news of the incident spread like wildfire. With the rise of the digital age, the footage of the encounter quickly made its way onto social media platforms, news stations, and online forums. The video went viral, sparking fresh debates and discussions about justice, violence, and race. People from all walks of life shared their opinions, some praising Tyson's bravery, others condemning the violence. For a few fleeting moments, the name Mike Tyson dominated the headlines once more, his legendary status both complicated and solidified by the events of that afternoon. Among the cacophony of opinions, one voice rose above,